Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Nope. Hi, everyone. Hello? Do we need to trouble? Oh, hello? Does that work? Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Walter Awards. If you don't mind taking your seats, we are going to get started really shortly. Thank you so much.
There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Annual Walter D. Myers Awards. It is so good to see the top half of so many familiar faces out in the crowd. My name is Min Lei. I'm a board member for We Need Diverse Books, as well as a children's book author, and I am thrilled to be with all of you today, especially since this is our first year back in person since 2019. This is also a special treat for me because I am, you might not know this, a former DC Public Library employee. So to be in this space and see it is just really wonderful. So first, I'd love to extend a warm welcome to our 2022 winners and honorees that we're celebrating today, along with our Walter Award Judging Committee, who spent countless hours reading and discussing submissions. So thank you for all your hard work and your impeccable taste. I'd also like to express our gratitude to the team from BookBub, who has generously sponsored this event. Many thanks to BookBub for being here and for your wonderful support. So please give them a round of applause. And I want to have a special acknowledgement for the students in the audience who are joining us from 4 DC area schools. Ultimately, this event is for you. The books that we're honoring today, they were written with you in mind, so we hope that you'll feel free to ask questions during the symposium Q&A. So thank you for joining us today. And I also want to provide a quick update about one of our honorees, Melinda Lowe, who had planned to be participating in our symposium today in person. Unfortunately, she recently caught COVID and wasn't able to come to DC to join us today. So Melinda, if you're listening at home, we hope you have a speedy recovery and just know that you're very missed today. So a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. To keep everyone as safe as possible, we unfortunately won't be serving any refreshments after the ceremony, but guests, however, are welcome to attend the book signing in the adjoining event space. We'll also be utilizing all the funds that had been reserved for refreshments to purchase more Walter winning and honor titles for low-income schools and libraries. So we'll put that money to good use. And finally, please remember to silence your cell phones. Even if you have a really fun ringtone, we don't want to interrupt our amazing speakers. I have a fun ringtone, so I've already turned mine off. And now, It is my great honor to introduce our MC for the 2022 Walter Awards, Grace Lin. Grace is the author and illustrator of dozens of widely acclaimed books for young readers, from board books through middle grade, all of which just happen to be favorites in the Lay household. And you might not know this, but among the many paths that she considered, she thought about being a figure skater, a falafel vendor, a spy, and a movie star. So, though I know you would have been wildly successful in any of those careers, the world is very fortunate that you settled on becoming, not settled, that you decided to, that you decided to honor us by being an author and illustrator. In fact, her contribution to the field is receiving special recognition this year because she is the winner of the 2022 Children's Literature Legacy Award. Which is an award which honors a creator whose books have made a significant and lasting contribution to literature for children. So with that, please join me in welcoming Grace Lin.
All right. Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Hold on. I'm a lot shorter. Hold on a second. Thank you for that really lovely and warm introduction, Min. I'm so thrilled to be your MC for this morning's symposium and awards ceremony. I've been practicing everybody's name, so hopefully I do not butcher anyone's, but please forgive me if I do. So, the Walter D. Myers Award is named for prolific children's and young adult author Walter D. Myers. The third National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, Myers was a champion of diversity in children's books. This is a cause that everyone in this room is passionate about. It is why we are gathered here today, and it is being challenged. Right now, our country is experiencing a rash of book bans nationwide. I actually have quite a lot to say about that later, but for now, it's just enough to say and to point out that most of the time, these bans target diverse books. In fact, according to PEN America, 41% of the books banned in the United States feature protagonists of color, and 31% included LGBTQ+ topics or characters. We know that children need to see themselves on the pages of books. We know that when children read books about people whose lives are different than their own, they become more empathetic. Now, more than ever, we need to lean into that empathy, and we must ensure that our children are able to do the same. On that note, I'd like to introduce our symposium moderator, Deb Taylor, the 2015 recipient of the Coretta Scott King Virginia Hamilton Award for Lifetime Achievement, and a retired librarian from the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore, Maryland. Deb is also an avid sports fan. She once said, "One thing tennis has in common with teen services in libraries is that someone is always predicting their demise and both always finding ways to remain relevant." We are so grateful that she is here to moderate our discussion on children's literature. Please join me in welcoming Deb Taylor.
Thank you so much, Grace, for that wonderful introduction. And I am so thrilled to be here and to have this conversation. And I'd like to welcome Kekla Magoon to join me. Two of our other honorees, Eden Royce and Natasha Donovan, will also answer a couple of questions in pre-recorded videos. Let me start off by giving some brief introductions of our panelists. Kekla is best known for her NAACP Image Award nominated young adult novel, The Rock and the River. And in, yes? And in 2021, she received the Margaret Edwards Award from the American Library Association for her body of work. She's too young to have that award, but that's okay. Natasha Donovan is a Canadian illustrator who focuses on comics and children's illustration, and she is a member of the Métis Nation of British Columbia. Eden Royce is a writer of Black Gothic horror, and she comes from Charleston, South Carolina, and references the local Gullah Geechee culture in her writing. Please welcome our panelists. Kekla, your books often deal with themes, and certainly the book that you're being honored for today, that many don't want young people to read, and or even to discuss. So what is your response to the efforts to deny the importance of these stories?
One of the reasons I started writing about the material I wrote about is because when I was young, I didn't have access to all of the history of our country. I grew up in Indiana in a predominantly white community, and I didn't learn about, for example, the Black Panther Party, which is the subject of my new nonfiction, Revolution in Our Time, the Black Panther Party's Promise to the People, which is one of the Walter Honor books this year for the teen category. And it came out of just my lack of knowledge that I was raised with, right? I knew a lot about the civil rights movement. I was a biracial child in a predominantly white community. I struggled to fit in. I was teased for my hair and you know, being different, and I often felt different, right? And one of the things that I latched onto as a young person was the narratives of struggle and the narratives of equality and progress, right? Overturning segregation, you know, the story of Dr. King, the story of Rosa Parks. I grabbed onto those narratives because I was trying to understand this. Now I know the term cognitive dissonance, right? I didn't know that when I was 12. The cognitive dissonance between feeling like an outcast, feeling different, feeling like there were opportunities I didn't have because of the way that I looked, and then the narrative that I was taught, which was that we solved all race issues in the 1960s. Everything's fine, everyone's equal, right? That was what I was taught growing up in the 80s and 90s. And it didn't feel true to me, but I didn't have the information to really understand why it wasn't true and what the struggles were that I was experiencing. And so for me, that was the springboard to wanting to learn, the springboard to wanting to write, and the springboard to wanting other people to have access to the history that I didn't have. I know that a lot of people have questions about who the Black Panther Party was and lots of other pieces of our history, but it's because we don't have the information. And so I believe that the more information we have, the more informed we can be about understanding who we are, where we've come from, and where we need to go.
That brings us to the theme of today's symposium, which is open books, open minds. What does that mean to you and to the work that you do?
I love that phrasing, open books, open minds, because I think to me, it speaks to learning, it speaks to education, it speaks to the fact that if we have questions, all we have to do is open a book, right? And we can find answers. And ideally, we open lots of different kinds of books. And so for me, it's about keeping our minds open, keeping ourselves open to experiences that are beyond what we know, and trying to introduce ourselves to new ideas, to things that might seem a little scary at first, things that might seem unfamiliar at first. That's how we grow, right? And that's how we form our identities. So for me, it's all about openness, it's all about sharing and education, and about diversity too.
Now let's hear from our honorees, Eden Royce and Natasha Donovan, who, as I said, couldn't join us today in person, but who recorded their thoughts beforehand.
I do this work because I love books and stories, and in particular, I love how each one has this special power to make us look at the world in just slightly different ways. And one of the things that I love so much about Borders and Thomas King's writing and his creation of the story is he's just so adept at using humor to kind of poke holes in the concept of the border, which is a structure that a lot of us, we often take as a given. So even just that kind of small shift in perspective, like being reminded that the border as we currently know it is constructed across pre-existing nations that can change the way that the reader thinks. And I just think that's very valuable and exciting.
Well, for me, in a lot of my interviews, people ask about what I've put into the book or into the story. And for me, that question is about what the reader brings to the book. Some readers bring a certain cynicism like, let's see if this book is going to be worth my time. Other readers, however, bring a curiosity and an eagerness and this desire to immerse themselves in the story. So to me, that's what open books, open minds means. Not only have you as a reader physically opened to the book, but you've brought with you a genuine interest in what you may find and a willingness to experience what might be in those pages.
You know, as book bans on diverse books continue to sweep across the country, what can our audience members do to ensure that all young people can have access to these various stories?
I think that's definitely a big challenge in the country right now. And I think there are several things that we can do as citizens, as young people, as teachers, as librarians, as parents and community members. I think, first and foremost, to the extent of our ability, we can buy books and support diverse books. We can ask our libraries to buy and support diverse books and make it known that there are people in the community that want those titles to be part of the collection. That's really, really important. We can connect with our school librarians, we can connect with public librarians and ask them what the resources and opportunities in your local community are, because I think there are different pockets around the country where different structures and needs are in place. And so getting to know your local librarians love connecting people, they love finding information. If you have a question, a librarian will do their level best to get the answer, and they will chase it until they have the answer, and that's their strength and power. And so that is what I would recommend, is to make friends with those people, learn about your school board, how it operates, right? Because often the public is invited to attend school board meetings. You can go and just be there and support diverse books and stand up, because we have a lot of people standing up to say, we're scared of these texts. We need people to stand up and say, we're in support of these texts. We crave these texts. Yes. These texts are important. And that's true whether you're an adult in the community or whether you're a teen in the community. You know, making friends with your school administration and being prepared to, gather your fellow students together to say these are the books that we need and want, your school librarian, your administration, and also your city council, right? Just get to know the people in your local community that have power and understand how you can and have conversations with people in power. That's the key.
One of the hallmarks of your book is how much detail there is. Can you give us some insight into your research process?
Absolutely. The research process was years long.
Can I just say, when I met you many years ago, you said, I'm working on this book about the Panthers. It was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. It was, in fact, over a decade ago. My first novel, The Rock and the River, that you referred to, is about a teen boy in 1968 Chicago whose father is a civil rights activist, and his older brother joins the Black Panther Party, and so he finds himself caught between these two seemingly opposite ideologies of change. They're not as opposite as they seemed, right? But that was the narrative. And I was exploring my own questions about, I always thought if I'd been alive in the 1960s, I would have been a civil rights activist. But then I learned about the Black Panther Party, and I was like, what if I would have been a Black Panther, right? And so I wrote this novel to explore that. And so I did some research way back then, before 2009, when that book came out. I started research on the Black Panther Party. But when the book came out, and middle school and high school students were reading it, teachers and librarians started asking me, well, we're teaching your book, what nonfiction resources can we bring to support this lesson? And there wasn't a lot that had been written even for adults that was very accessible. There were a lot of autobiographies and biographies. There were a handful of very, very academic texts for the adult market, but there wasn't really anything super teen friendly. There were some photo essays, but then that doesn't give you the whole story, right? There was a lot of material to sort through if you were going to try to teach this lesson. And so that's when I went on this journey, this research journey that ended up lasting me about 10 years. I traveled all around the country. I visited Oakland, California, where the Panthers were founded, as well as places they had chapters around the country, Seattle and Chicago and New York and Boston and Indianapolis. There were so many places where the Panthers were active. I met former Panthers. I attended film screenings. I read a lot of biographies and went through archives, putting on little white gloves to go through, folders of ephemera and photos and old newspapers, because the party published a newspaper and things like that. So it was very hands-on, because 10 years ago, nobody was talking about the Black Panther Party. Black Lives Matter didn't exist. We hadn't had this resurgence of awareness of police brutality and systemic racism in our pop culture consciousness yet. And so people were like, what is it that you're doing, right? There wasn't that much material available online. There's much more now. So it was a very hands-on process and a very lengthy process to try to capture all of that learning that I did that took me around the country and took me a decade, to try to capture that in an experience that somebody else could have on their coffee table, somebody else could check out from their library or discuss in their classroom.
That's fascinating. Let's now hear from Eden Royce speaking about her research process.
Most of my research was done by talking with people that I already knew personally. My family members, their friends, my friends. And the process was mainly asking, so what do you remember about this topic or that topic? And just listening. For so long, stories of my people have gone unheard by those outside the community. Or if the story was told, it was stripped of its origins and represented by others who didn't really see the need to credit our people for those stories. On a TV show I watched recently, they gave a definition of the word history as past events that have been recorded, and that definition excluded oral histories, which is what my people and many indigenous societies have relied on and still rely on for passing along our practices and our customs and our experiences. So I did do my research for Root Magic, and it was participating in just an age-old Gullah Geechee tradition of sharing stories with loved ones and sharing our own oral history.
Okay, now we have a question for Natasha, who is the illustrator on the panel. There are times when her art is part of the story and sometimes when it stands alone. And so she's going to tell us a little bit about her illustrating process.
When I'm working on a comic, I have to try to strike a balance between directly explaining the text visually and adding moments or imagery that hopefully enhance the story. Borders is such a short story that I had to lean a little more heavily toward the latter. And luckily, Thomas King was very willing to give the editor and I free rein when it came to working on the adaptation process. And mostly this is just very intuitive. I read a lot and I'm a very visual reader. So my brain is already in the habit of kind of constructing a visual narrative while I read. So it's just a question of bringing that into the world.
Kekla, even though you were writing about an organization with many influences, there are also personalities that stand out in your narrative in terms of their impact, particularly Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. How did they come to be such important individuals in the Panthers?
I love the way this is phrased. How did they become such important individuals in the Panthers? Well, they were the founders of the party, and yet the party itself is bigger than any individual, it's bigger than any, two people or any handful of people, and yet when we tell the story, we love to focus on the heroes, right? We pick the leaders, we pick the flashiest, splashiest names, right, to emphasize. And so I think within the landscape of the party, there was much more equality and much more balance than we sometimes have in a narrative because of the way we like to tell stories, right, with heroes at the center. The party was very local, right? So Huey and Bobby were very prominent in the Oakland party, but then there were chapters all around the country who had stars of their own and leaders of their own. And one of the challenges for me in trying to tell the story of the party as a whole, right, trying to talk about the party as if it was a biography, right, is not to let any one individual become too shiny in the landscape, to show that we can all be part of a movement like the Panthers. We can all be community organizers. We can all be on that level. I think that their partnership was very dynamic because Huey was a really strong thinker, and he had a lot of the ideology behind the party. He was able to articulate a lot of the ideology behind the party, and a lot of his writings were really powerful. And then Bobby was the kind of organizer, people person who drew everybody together and was already active in a youth community center, right, and was saying, you know, Huey was sitting up in the Ivy, what we call the Ivy Tower, right, of college, right, and talking intellectually, but Bobby was out in the community actually meeting kids who wanted to do something and who were feeling frustrated and angry and wanted something to do with that energy. And so together they were able to create something that drew on both of those things, this intellectual movement and framework, but this groundswell of teen energy, right? Because the Panthers were predominantly teenagers. The median age of Panthers was 19. So that means more than half of Panthers were 19 and younger. And so, you know, they really spoke to this young generation.
I was really struck by the attention you paid to the women in the party. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. That was another tricky thing because the Panther image, right, tends to be black men with guns, right, period, the end. But in fact, at the height of the party's activity in the early 70s, the party was majority women in terms of who was volunteering and who was serving the breakfast program for school children and who was operating the health clinics and who was staffing all the community centers, right? And so those snapshot images that were perpetuated in the media were slightly misleading because most of what they were doing was caring for the community and being really feminine and feminist about a lot of their organizing. And so I really wanted to find a way to balance spotlighting women without making it seem like we were talking about women's role in the party, right? When I met with Erica Huggins, who was one of the Panther leaders, I said something about, well, I really want to emphasize women's role in the party, and she stopped me and she said, it wasn't women's role in the party. You would never say, you know, men's role in the party, right? That's a kind of marginalizing framework. Women were the party. And so I quoted her on that in the book. Women were the party. They were doing this work, right? And so I made an effort to balance the leaders I was spotlighting to make sure that there were some men spotlighted and some women spotlighted and trying to find language to talk about how people of all genders were part of this movement and that it wasn't strictly a male-dominated thing.
You know, when we think about the Great Migration in American history, many overlook those who left the South and went to California. And that also had an influence on the Panthers. It certainly seems to be a part of the stories of the two individuals we spoke about earlier.
Yes, yes. Both Huey and Bobby's families originated in the eastern southern United States and then came out to California. And Bobby was in the military for a time. Huey was raised in California mostly, but they had those southern roots. And even the party itself is also kind of a transplant from the South because before Huey and Bobby, quote unquote, founded right, the Black Panther Party in Oakland, as the organization it became, there were roots in movements from the East Coast. So Stokely Carmichael, who was active in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the main organizing groups of the Civil Rights Movement, college students, was part of an organizing operation in Lowndes County, Alabama in 1965. So before the Panthers were founded in 1966, there was a voter rights registration drive in Lowndes County, Alabama. Lowndes County was a majority black county that had never had black elected officials because the majority of black people in Lowndes County were not registered to vote and hadn't been allowed to vote for various reasons of what we call disenfranchisement, but they were being prevented from registering even though they were legally allowed to. And so there was a lot of voter intimidation happening. There were all kinds of factors preventing people from registering. And so SNCC went in with teams of volunteers to register people to vote, escort them to the polls, and make sure people were safe to participate in an election. And they called their party and their candidate the Black Panther Party, and they put a little picture of a panther on the ballot because a lot of people couldn't read, and so they'd go vote for the Panther and then go home. That was the slogan. But that was organizing that was taking place in the civil rights movement, and then around the country, different groups cropped up saying, we like that language of Panther. And the idea behind the Black Panther was that animal only attacks when it is under threat. When it has been backed into a corner and has no other option, it will fight back in self-defense. And so that was the spark.
One of the things I was most struck with when I read your book was the clear perspective you provide on the importance of the Black Panthers in U.S. history. We have this idea that nonfiction is supposed to be quote unquote neutral, as if that was a thing, as if that could ever happen. Can you speak a little bit about the idea of point of view in writing for young people?
Absolutely. So when I talk about point of view with regard to history specifically, I usually have a pen with me or some kind of object that I can hold up. Because what I do is I say, okay, so if I had a pen in my hand, you can visualize in your mind what a pen looks like. If I held it up to you like this, right, where all you can see is that end, that circle, right, you would say, I'm looking at a circle. But if I turn that pen vertically, then you see, oh, it's a line, right? And then if I turn that to the side, you say, oh, it's a line, but it looks like this. Maybe you see that little clip thing, right, that sticks off the side of a pen that you use to put in your pocket, right? If you open it up, you unscrew it and you pull it open, you're like, oh, it's got ink inside. Whoa, this is exciting. I didn't know that just by looking at that one circle in the end, right?
Right.
And so with regard to American history, right, if we only tell the version of American history, the information about American history that is seen through the lens of a white, upper middle class, cisgendered man, which is what most of our history has been for a long time, right, we're just seeing that little circle, and we think we're looking at a circle. It's not that we're not looking at part of the pen. It's not that that's an untrue version of history, right? It's just it's not the whole picture, right? And so when we start telling the history from an LGBTQ perspective, we get to see the line. When we start telling from a Black perspective, we get to see the little hump. When we open it up, right, and we tell women's history, right, we get to see the ink. And so if we don't have a lot of different perspectives talking about these factual events that took place in the past, we're never going to have a full picture. We're never going to completely understand what American history is and how we got to where we are and what our country is now. And so for me, that's the difference. It's presented, when we talk about history and perspective, it's like, oh, you're telling an alternate history. No, it's not an alternate history. We're adding to the information, right? It's a different perspective that helps us understand and round out. And so history is always, we're always looking at it through the lens of today, right? If I had written about the Black Panthers in the 1960s, there's a lot of, talking about men and women. Today, I looked for language that was gender inclusive, right? And that is, how do you talk about the past in a way that's gender inclusive? Well, that's something that I'm looking at because I'm looking at it through a contemporary lens and I'm writing to contemporary teens. And so things like that change over time, things like that change depending on who the teller and writer of the story is. And that's only enriching our understanding. It's not taking anything away. And so for me, that is a helpful metaphor, right? Thinking about that pen turning is a helpful metaphor for thinking about what it means to expand our understanding of history.
What do you think today's social movements can learn from the Panthers?
Oh, so much. I mean, I think the couple of things I typically say are, one, that you don't have to be a grown-up to be a change maker, right? Not just the Black Panthers, but the civil rights era. The civil rights era organizers were predominantly teenagers. We're talking high school students, we are talking college students, we are talking young 20s, we are also talking elementary school and middle school students, right, who protested, who marched, who were arrested, who were injured in the process of fighting for civil rights and in the process of fighting in the Black Power movement. And that is something that is very, very often washed out of the way we tell history. We talk about Dr. King, right? I thought Dr. King was this, old established man. He was 39 when he was killed. 39, that means the majority of his ministry took place in his 20s and 30s. That's not very old. He was considered a young upstart by society, right? So was Malcolm X, so were Huey and Bobby and the Panthers, right? These are people who changed the world, and yet We talk about Rosa Parks, who is an amazing leader in her own right, but part of why she's held up as an amazing leader is because she's an adult. And they keep wanting us to not remember that it was all the teens that stood up and made that change. So that's one.
That's great.
And then the second thing is that the Panthers, like we were talking about with these leaders, right? The Panthers weren't just the leaders. The Panthers were everybody in the community. And sometimes I think we don't stand up for change because we think the part that we can play is too small. And so it is very important to me to express that there is no part of making change that is too small. If all you can do is walk up to your librarian and say, I want diverse books in my library, that's part of making change, right? Because if 100 people in your school do that, your librarian is gonna know there's a lot of people that want this change, they're gonna make an effort, right? There are so many things that we don't do because we feel like they're too small. I don't know if I'm gonna go to that protest today, right? Because I'm just one person in the crowd, right? When we talk about, historically, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, we tend to talk about Martin Luther King making his I Have a Dream speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. That was a powerful speech, it was a powerful moment, but the most powerful thing about it was not the words he spoke, but the fact that 250,000 people from all around the country came together to stand and protest just be there on the National Mall, maybe holding a sign, right? That act was actually what changed the system, because the leaders of that march, because they drew so many people, the powers that be said, uh-oh, we better take these people seriously. And they were invited to a table they'd never been invited to before at the White House. That wouldn't have happened just on the merits of Dr. King's speech. It was because people mobilized in ways that were relatively simple. Like, I'm gonna come stand on the National Mall. They had to get on a bus and travel across the country. That's a big deal, right? But in the grand scheme of things, like, not everybody's gonna be the speaker on the podium, right? And that's okay. We don't have to be that. We can do our little part.
Well, that's terrific. And we want to open the floor now to questions from the audience. Please line up at the microphone.
Oh, that one?
Okay, over here.
I was like, where is it?
If you're interested, and please stick to one question only. If possible, we'd like to have student guests ask questions first. So if there are any young people in particular or anyone who would like to ask questions, please join us at the microphone. Don't be shy.
You can do it.
You can do it.
Come on.
This might be your part to get that question raised
Yes. Yes, yes.
that Kekla was just talking about. That's right.
Yeah. Solidarity.
Oh, I see somebody's coming. Yay!
Yay!
Thank you so much for getting us started.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. One question is, so when you were researching, like, how did you know which cities to research, like, to look at the archives and everything? How did you know which cities to go to?
That's a great question. How did I know what cities to go to? I knew a little bit about the Panthers because I had done some reading beforehand. So I found a list in one of the books that I read of cities where the Panthers had been active. So I knew they had been active in Oakland and Seattle and Chicago, and they were active in about 40 cities around the country, so I won't list them all. But there were two things that helped me. There were a couple of cities that I knew I wanted to go to because the chapters had been very active and had a lot going on. Like Chicago was a chapter that had a health clinic and a free breakfast program, and one of the leaders there named Fred Hampton was very well known around the country, and that his story was going to be very important, so I knew I had to go there. Seattle was another chapter where it was one of the first chapters that had opened after California when the Panther started to expand, and I had a biography of someone from Seattle, so I wanted to focus on that location. But also, so, knowing which cities were important to the Panthers was part of it, but also, I'm not super wealthy. I can't just afford to fly to all the cities I want to, right? So part of the places I was able to research were places I was going anyway. If I was invited to speak at a school or a library in a different place, before I would go, I would check and see what resources they had in their library. So I found some surprising places, like in Missouri. I went to the Missouri Historical Society, and they had a lot of material about protests and civil rights movement work in Missouri that I hadn't expected to find because I was invited to speak at the library in St. Louis. So it was a little bit of planning and a little bit of just kismet. Wherever I happened to be, I looked for Panther news.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question. Great question.
Hi. My question is, what did you do when when you were you had a question, but you couldn't really find anything to answer that question?
Yes, when I had a question, but I couldn't find anything to answer that question. That is a very common problem in research, in historical research especially. There are gaps in the narrative. There are gaps in the record. And often you find pieces of information that conflict, right? And so there's a lot of sorting through information. So for me, what I did was, if there were gaps in the research, I would make a guess. I would say, this is what I think happened here. But then in my notes, in the back of the book, I would say, this is based on, here's what I thought based on this, right? So I provided as much evidence as I could for the conclusion that I came to. And there were a few moments like that in the book where I would say, okay, well, I know this happened here and then, I know this happened here and then. How did we get from A to B? Or really, how did we get from A to C, right? What is B? I don't know what B is. B could be this, it could be this, it could be this. So sometimes I would present, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. I think, based on my understanding of the situation, it's most likely this, right? And I would try to explain why, and I would try to have as many sources as possible to back that up. But there's definitely some things that I couldn't get answers to. There were a few things that I couldn't talk about in the book because I couldn't find anything to back them up. Like something I heard someone say in an interview that I couldn't find any documentation for. I could either say, well, this is what so-and-so told me, but I couldn't find anything to back it up, or I would sometimes leave that out because people's memories aren't always 100% accurate about things that happened in the past, especially things that have a potential to be inflammatory or upsetting to people. I want to make sure that that's really, really well documented.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great question.
Yeah.
I was wondering, so you said back then, for your research process, there wasn't as much information or a lot about it as there is now. So I was wondering, if you were to write your book now, what would you change about the characters, or how you wrote the story, or what you added?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. Fortunately, there isn't a lot that I would change. I just think I would be able to do it faster, because what happened was so for example, in 2010 when I first went to Oakland, the Black Panther newspaper was not digitized. Meaning you couldn't go online and be like, I want to read issues of the Black Panther newspaper and just find that online and do it from your couch at home, right? I had to physically go to Oakland and sit there with little white gloves on and flip through all the issues of 10 years of newspapers, right? And that took a lot of time. And if I could do it at home, it would have taken me less time. So it's less in my research. Now they're at my fingertips, whereas before I had to go comb and hunt for them, if that makes sense. But I did find a couple of, in response to that question about holes, right? I did find a couple of articles that would have filled in a couple of those gaps a little more clearly for me. And so there is a little bit more information that's coming to light. So there's a couple things I could have included in the book that I didn't include because I have a little more confirmation on them now than I had back then. But fortunately, I haven't run into anything that has changed my understanding of the Panthers or that I would want to sort of undo and redo differently. It's just little things here and there. But that is a really great question.
That's a great question.
Really great question, yeah.
How did talking to some of the Panthers influence your perspective on modern day protests like BLM?
How did talking to some of the Panthers influence my perspective on modern day protests? Yeah, it simultaneously, I think, is frustrating, right, to hear people talk about things they were doing 50 years ago that we're still doing now, right? The idea that the Panthers took to the streets to protest police brutality, and guess what? We're still taking to the streets to protest police brutality. So talking to them about their experiences and how fresh that felt to me in the wake of Trayvon Martin being killed initially, as well as, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and whatnot, hearing how uprisings took place in 1965 and 66, and uprisings took place in 2022 or 2020 as well, that was a little bit disheartening to me. But at the same time, it gave me hope because I see in young people today, I see that same fire and passion that I see in the Panthers. You know, they've been through a lot right now. They're elders now, but they still have that fire when they talk about their experiences. And I see that same fire in young people when I go out to schools and libraries and I meet with, you know, racial justice activism groups and see the work that they're doing to create change in their own schools and communities. Like, that gives me hope, and those parallels are still there. I think that it really brings home this idea that everybody needs to do their little part, whatever it is. Like, my part happens to be writing stories and talking about these issues and hopefully sparking conversations that do take place among teenagers and among communities. And that's the part I can do. And for other people, it's protesting. For other people, it's creating art in different ways, right? For other people, it might be leadership. For other people, it might be running for office. For other people, it might be writing to their congresspeople and calling them all the time, right? People have different strengths. And the fact that every Panther has their own unique story about how they came to the party and what they contributed to the party gives me hope that we all can make a difference ourselves today.
Great. Thank you. Great question.
What was the most difficult part of the process for you?
The most difficult part of the well, to be fair, the most difficult part of the process was getting the book published. Because when I started this process, like I said, nobody was talking about these issues. I was very strange, right? I was lucky to get my first novel published, and it took me quite a long time to find the right publisher because people were afraid to talk about the Panthers. People didn't really understand the Panthers, but I needed someone to agree to publish it without fully understanding the Panthers because I hadn't written the book yet, right? And I was writing it, and so it ended up being that I had to write the whole book. And I had to be in the publishing industry long enough to find a wonderful editor who is here, who was willing to take that leap with me and say, let's learn about this, let's teach about this, right? And you know, the fact that they poured so much energy into the book, and we have all these amazing images in the book, right? The photo research is the second hardest thing, was actually finding all the photos. I wanted a very thick book because I knew it had to talk about all of American history as well as the Panthers, as well as where we are now, right? It's a very thick book. And I wanted it to feel inviting, which means, to me, visuals, right? Pictures. And so I wanted there to be several hundred pictures in the book. There ended up being almost 200 pictures in the book. But for every single photo that's in the book, I have to find the photographer, make sure that they give me permission to use their photograph because it's their intellectual property. That's their creative work. And so we had to find those people and pay them, and that was a very difficult process for me. But so much fun, and the book is really beautiful because of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We actually have time for one more. Well,
I can go fast.
We go really fast.
I'll go fast.
We go really fast to get these last questions.
Yes, I'll do it.
What motivated you to keep going while you were doing the process?
I very nearly gave up several times, but the thing that kept me going was knowing how important it was, and that someday someone was going to understand that, someone was going to appreciate that, and that happened to be my editor, Andrea, who's sitting over here, and now lots and lots of other people. So really believing that this was important kept me going.
Great question.
Yeah.
How did you feel while writing your books?
How does it feel?
How did you feel while you was writing your books?
How did I feel while I was writing the book? Ooh, okay. Because it was such a long process, I felt a lot of things. I felt really excited about discovering all this new knowledge. I felt scared sometimes that nobody was ever going to get to read it. I felt angry about how much of American history wasn't taught to me when I was young. I felt empowered by the ability to share that knowledge that I was gaining with other people. But most of all, I felt like I was doing something satisfied. I felt satisfied, like I'm doing my part. I'm doing what I can. And that was really, really powerful.
Great, thank you.
My question is, how did you meet one of the female leaders in the Black Panther Party?
When did I meet?
How did you meet them?
How did I meet them? So I met Erica Huggins, and I actually talked to Erica Huggins, but I also met Kathleen Cleaver, another Black Panther leader, and I met somebody else who's now, my brain is, I emailed Angela Davis, but I didn't actually talk to her, and there was somebody else that I met personally, but Erica Huggins I met at the 50th anniversary celebration of the Black Panther Party. I wanted to just go and be part of the celebration. The Panthers were founded in 1966, so in 2016 they had a big celebration in Oakland where a lot of the former Panthers came, and that's where I met Bobby Seale and several other people. and had coffee with Erica Huggins and talked with her about these things, and it was very much through connections. I had a connection with another librarian who knew her, who worked in the area, who called her up and said, hey, I want you to come meet my author friend. So I saw her at the big celebration, but then I actually got to meet and sit down with her privately in 2016 in Oakland, and that's how that came about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please, a big round of applause to our young people.
Yes, thank you for questions.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tekla.
Thank you.
Do you want us to go over here?
I don't know. Thanks, everybody.
Well, that was amazing. I think we all agree there. I think let's give our wonderful moderator, Deb Taylor, another round of applause. And let's give another round of applause to Kekla Magoon, Natasha Donovan, Thomas King, and Eden Royce. All right. Well, with the symposium concluded, we can now move right into the 2022 Walter Dean Myers Awards ceremony. For a little bit of background, We Need Diverse Books hosted its first Walter Awards in 2016 to honor excellence in diverse children's literature. Back then, our judging committee received just under 50 submissions from publishers. And the children's book industry as a whole remained very white, straight, and cis, especially if you looked at the bestsellers lists. Fast forward to today. For the 2022 Walter Awards cycle, we received nearly 400 submissions, about an 8-fold increase since 2016. And if you take a look at the New York Times bestseller list now, you'll find numerous authors of color, along with LGBTQ+ authors as well. Indeed, a couple of writers we're honoring today have also happened to appear on that list. We've certainly come a long way, but we wouldn't have gotten to this point without the pioneers before us. Pioneers like Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, Virginia Hamilton, and yes, Walter Dean Myers, which this award was named after. So let's take a moment to learn more about Walter and the legacy that he had left behind.
Writer, teacher, advocate, literary giant. Walter Dean Myers embodied these roles and much more. His enduring legacy lives on in dozens of award-winning books that demonstrate his dedication to children everywhere by helping them discover the power of reading. Throughout his long life, Myers won many career-defining awards, including the Newbery Honor and the Coretta Scott King Award. He received the first ever Michael L. Prince Award for Young Adult Literature in 2000 for his groundbreaking novel Monster, a book that illuminated the plight of young Black men in contemporary America. From 2012 to 2013, Myers served as the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, an honor bestowed by the Library of Congress, the Children's Book Council, and Every Child a Reader. On March 15, 2014, Myers wrote his final piece, a New York Times essay entitled, "Where Are the People of Color in Children's Books?" which helped launch the We Need Diverse Books movement. Upon his death on July 1, 2014, the world lost one of the greatest voices in children's literature and one of the strongest advocates for inclusive representation in books. But Myers' legacy lives on. In 2016, WNDB presented the inaugural Walter Dean Myers Award for Outstanding Children's Literature, affectionately dubbed the Walter, to honor the memory of its namesake and to celebrate diverse children's books. Each year, a panel of judges selects the winners and honorees in 2 categories, teen and younger readers, to showcase the best in children's publishing. Past winners include John Lewis and Elizabeth Acevedo. The current National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, Jason Reynolds, is a 2-time recipient and was mentored by Walter Dean Myers. Since the Walter Awards inception, WNDB has also distributed the winning books to schools and libraries nationwide. As of 2020, we have donated over 12,000 copies of our winning titles and have more giveaways planned. Along with our co-hosts, the Library of Congress, please join us in congratulating this year's winners and honorees.
All right, so I know we are all now so excited to celebrate these amazing books. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk to you a bit about why I think these books are so important, especially at this time. And to do that, I'd like to start with sort of a metaphor that starts with when I was 13 years old, when I first got glasses. I think this was, there we go. Now, at age 13, I did not want glasses, and I sulked as I left the doctor's office. But even while sulking, I found myself staring at the world around me. Change slide. With my glasses on, everything was so crisp. I could see every leaf on the trees. I could see the green ground in front of me was made of ribbons of grass. It was like a harsh light was spotlighting everything I saw. I remember feeling a sense of shock. Was this what the world really looked like? Well, I kind of feel what is going on in the world today is kind of like our country just got forced to put on a pair of glasses. Change slide. Because a lot of things have been happening these last few years. COVID, the racial and social unrest with the responding rise of Black Lives Matter and anti-Asian hate, the great resignation of people leaving their jobs, and book banning. Change slide. Why? Because people are finally starting to see the world clearly. When I first got my glasses at age 13 in the beginning, it truly felt like it was too much. At first, I felt like I couldn't take it all. I would take my glasses off just to feel the comfort of the familiar blurriness, the comfort of not having to see everything with such clarity. But even if we choose not to see things, that does not mean they are not there. I got my glasses, and I suddenly saw all the leaves on the trees. I suddenly saw the legs on the spider. But of course, the leaves had always been there. The spider had always had legs. It was just that now I finally saw them. Just like now, how so many are starting to see the people and issues they didn't see before in our community and in our society. I feel that I know this is true because of how so many have seen me my whole life. Change slide. I grew up in a suburb of the city of Utica during a time when it was a very depressed city. And being so depressed is actually the reason why we ended up there. The hospital in Utica specifically recruited immigrant doctors who had just finished their US residencies, new immigrant doctors, because honestly, non-immigrant doctors had much better options than moving to a poor area far from any major cities for lesser pay. But my father, an immigrant from Taiwan, did not. So we moved to upstate New York, where I ended up being the only Asian girl, except for my sisters, in my elementary school. This made me feel very uncomfortable, being so different from everyone else. And one of the reasons why I was so uncomfortable was because of how the adults in my world dealt with it. Because when I was a child, the way adults dealt with race was by not talking about it. I remember in 5th grade, after I'd answered a question correctly, a boy burst in saying, "She just knows that because she's Chinese," only to be cut off by our teacher. She shook her head at him, then continued on with the lesson as if nothing had happened. But we all knew he was going to say, "She only knows that because she's Chinese." But we also all knew what my teacher meant by shaking her head. We did not talk about my race. I realize now that silencing my classmate was my teacher's way of trying to create what back then they called racially blind kids, or kids that don't see color. But as the only Asian in a classroom of white faces, I felt as if I had this shameful secret that everyone knew, but we didn't talk about. Instead of feeling colorless, I just felt like there was something wrong with me. Because ignoring race does not create kids who don't see color. Instead, it creates kids who don't see people of color. At least that was the case with one of my fellow classmates. Change slide. Because thanks to social media a couple years ago, I found myself reading an article from my hometown newspaper. As I mentioned earlier, the city near where I lived was very depressed. It is better now, and one of the reasons why is because it decided to become a refugee welcoming center and a way to help bolster the economy. Populations of refugees came to town, first Vietnamese, then Bosnian. While Utica is not back to its heyday of prosperity, the Refugee Resettlement Center has been fairly successful and has continued. Now, if you remember, a few years ago, the travel ban was announced, extremely limiting the entrance of any refugees. The center in Utica had been preparing to welcome a number of Syrian refugees, but with the ban, they had, of course, were not going to be coming. And accordingly, the center's budget was cut and people were laid off. The newspaper wrote about this in a very heartfelt way, telling it as a sad story. However, from the comments that followed, it was clear that many of the local population did not feel the same way. Change slide. One comment, however, upset me more than others. The comment said, "Too bad, don't need any more immigrants sucking off the system." Now, it wasn't so much what was said, though it was not kind. It was who wrote it, because the name of the person who wrote it was familiar. He was my 5th grade classmate. Now, this hit me hard because I realized that all these years, he had never seen me, even though my father had worked hard and attained his citizenship, and we were only in upstate New York because no American-born doctor wanted to work in the area. Even though I was in his class year after year after year, in the same cafeteria, in the same gym, on the same playground, he never saw me or my family. He never saw me as a friend, a classmate, or a part of his community. And if he were to see me and my family now, all he would see would be immigrants sucking off the system. Because when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we are really talking about humanity. We are saying that even though we may be different races and genders, we all have the simple bond of being human together. By ignoring diversity, by not seeing color, my classmate did not, could not see that we were human like him. So, how does this tie into book banning? Change slide. Well, it actually comes back to glasses. When my daughter was 4, our doctor told us that she had amblyophilia, a very common eye disorder in kids where the eyes and the brain are not working properly together. She needed lenses that would help strengthen the weakness, help strengthen the sight and brain connection, and basically fix the problem so she could see clearly. If she did not get glasses, we were told, it could permanently damage her vision. The books that are being banned, the books that we honor today, these books are like the glasses my daughter and I wear. Just like when I looked at a tree and saw every leaf, these books help kids look at their community and see every human. These books, when read and shared, can give kids a clear, true view of the world all around us. And I can't help but think that not having these books can cause permanent damage. It's those who did not have those books when they were younger that are trying to ban them now. These books are giving them a glimpse of what the world truly looks like, and it's too much for them. They want to keep their glasses off. They want the comfort of not having to see everything with such clarity. Because the people who are trying to ban books are, in a sense, trying to withhold glasses from a whole generation of kids. Yes, some kids will be fine, but for others, those who need these books to see the world, banning these books will permanently damage their vision, maybe even damage their perception of the world to the extent that they cannot recognize the humanity of their own community. So let's not let this happen. So today, at these Walter Awards, let's celebrate these wonderful, rich, vibrant books that will show kids the world. But after this celebration is over, after we clap and cheer and cry, please make sure you get these books and give them to as many kids as you can so that we can make sure that they can see. Thank you. But now let's get this party started. All right, so let's begin with our Young Reader Honorees. Though they were unable to join us today, we are proud to celebrate the work of Younger Reader Honorees Eden Royce, Thomas King, and Natasha Donovan. Eden is a member of the Gula Geechee Nation and the niece of a root worker. In speaking about her book, she said, "Root magic was born because I had never seen root work or any Southern conjure magic portrayed in a book I'd read or a film I'd watched as a kid that presented it as a positive practice." Thomas King's PhD dissertation was on Native American studies and works to explore the oral storytelling tradition as literature in Borders. After Borders was released as a short story in 1993, Natasha later worked with Thomas to adapt it into a graphic novel. Natasha Donovan is a self-taught illustrator from Vancouver, Canada. She prefers to work as early in the morning as possible because her head is cleared in those hours when the world is quiet. In adapting Borders into a graphic novel, Natasha has shared that it was an absolute dream project, and I'm also so completely relieved that I've finished it. I had stress dreams for a month in which I would get emails about having to draw a page for Borders. So please join me in honoring these authors and illustrator for the incredible work that they have done. Now, I'd love to introduce our 2022 Walter Award winner in the Younger Readers category. Rajini LaRocca is the author of Red, White, and Whole, amongst other titles for children. She is also a primary care physician who loves incorporating STEM topics into her books, with some including math puzzles, binary numbers, pattern making, and DNA. Her novel, Red, White, and Whole, is set in 1983, and some things Rajini loved most about the 80s included the big hair, the movies, such as Footloose and E.T., the skirts and leggings and overall fashion, and MTV music videos. Let's give a warm welcome to Rajini.
Thank you so much, Grace. Hello, everyone. So first, I have to say my thank yous. Thank you so much to We Need Diverse Books for all the work you do bringing diverse books to young readers. Thank you to the Walter Award Committee for this incredible honor. I can't tell you what it means that you chose Red, White, and Whole for the winner for the Walter Dean Myers Award for Younger Readers. In a year with so many incredible books, this award means even more to me. Congratulations to all the other honorees, Thomas, Natasha, and Eden, Angeline, Melinda, and Kekla. I am humbled to be among you. Thank you to my agent, Brent Taylor, for the best publishing partner in the world. Thank you to my incredible editor, Alexandra Cooper, who is here, and Rosemary Brosnan, and everyone at Quilltree Books and HarperCollins who published this book so beautifully and have supported it in every way. And thank you to my family, my parents, Kasturi and Chakravarti Narasimhan, who made me the person that I am, to my children, Joe and Mira, who are my heart and my greatest pride and joy, and to my husband, Lou, without whom I could never have written a word. So, when I was a child, books opened my mind to all kinds of possibilities. I was born in Bangalore, India, and I immigrated to the US as a baby, and I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. Yes, there were Indian people in Louisville, Kentucky in the 70s and 80s. As a kid, I loved books. I loved fiction and nonfiction. I loved comic books. I loved comic strips. You name it, I read it. And luckily, I had parents who loved that I loved books and let me read whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. So I read all kinds of stories and I empathized with all kinds of characters. I went with Meg Murray on her extraordinary journey to save her family. I grew up with the All-of-a-Kind family and their Jewish traditions. I learned about friendship and sacrifice from Charlotte's Web. I traveled to Narnia and Middle-earth. And I solved a mystery and thought about what it means to be an American in my favorite book as a kid, The West End Game. Books helped me understand what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. They made me dream about imaginary worlds. And thanks to a book called Ouch, all about cuts and other hurts, books got me interested in medicine. So when I visited my extended family in India, I was introduced to marvelous comics called Amar Chitra Kathas that depict stories from Indian history, mythology, and literature. And as an Indian American child growing up in the 70s and 80s in the US, I didn't have much of a cultural education beyond what my parents taught me. So these comics were invaluable in opening my mind to my own culture. I learned about Ganesha and Ashoka, Rabindranath Tagore and Mirabai, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. I read stories from the Panchatantra and tales of the minister Birbal that made me laugh. And I read stories like Abhimanyu and Savitri that made my heart swell and made me cry. So, from a young age, I dreamed of going to medical school, but I loved writing too. Once, in a creative writing class in high school, I told my teacher, I really love writing, but I know this is not going to be my career. I really hope that I get to go into medicine someday. And he told me something that changed my life. He said, "Who says you have to choose?" And the next day, he brought in a stack of books that had all been written by authors who happened to be doctors. Now, at the time, they were all white men, and many of them were dead. But that's okay. Because of these books opened my mind to another possibility, that I could return to writing someday, and that I wouldn't have to choose between medicine and books. Now, as a child, I never read about someone like me, an Indian immigrant living in the US, not in America and not in India. And I didn't really realize what I was missing until much later as an adult. And I finally read a story that captured some of my personal experiences and provided a mirror of my own life. That book was called The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri. And talk about mind-blowing and world-changing. It made me recognize how powerful it is to see yourself in a book, and how every person, and especially every young person, deserves to feel this way. It made me realize that stories like mine were worthy of being told, and that maybe someday someone would want to read about them. So, decades after that high school creative writing class, I started writing novels and picture books for young people. And not surprisingly, I ended up writing stories about people like me. So I wrote novels about Indian American kids who encountered magic and people from Shakespeare plays and baked and played baseball. And I wrote picture books about immigration and family, but also about math and science because I love those things. And then came the idea for Red, White, and Whole. So Red, White, and Whole is set in 1983, and it is about a 13-year-old girl named Reha who feels torn between the worlds of her Indian immigrant parents and her friends at school who are mostly white. And so she wants to be like any other American teenager. She wants to wear cool clothes, listen to awesome music, and go to a middle school dance. But her parents, and especially her mom, feel like she has better things to do with her time. So she's struggling with this when she finds that her mom has been diagnosed with leukemia, and then her whole world is turned upside down. And Reha feels like if she could just be the perfect daughter, the daughter that her parents want her to be, that she can somehow save her mother's life. So the idea for this story came to me as a metaphor of blood and all that it means in terms of biology and family and community. Blood in terms of cells, but also in terms of what we owe those we love. And I poured so much of my heart and soul into it. And although it's a work of fiction, it is very much based on my own experience as a girl who felt torn by all the different things she is: Indian and American, daughter and friend, powerless and powerful. Like Reha, I couldn't always tell which was the real me, the weekday American or the weekend Indian. And like Reha, I often felt simultaneously not American enough and not Indian enough, and wondered whether I truly belonged anywhere. Like Reha, I was interested in medicine, but had to rethink this when my mother's life was in danger, and I had to experience medicine from the point of view of a loved one. So I wanted to write a story in which the child I once was would recognize herself. We're a family who didn't always understand each other, but always loved each other, where every weekend was spent with friends and aunties and uncles, where evenings were spent watching sitcoms and eating rasam and marveling at the burst of a mustard seed. I also wanted to write a story where people who don't share my background could also see themselves in the universal struggles of adolescence, of wanting so desperately to be like everyone else, but needing to be yourself, of feeling divided, but finding a way to be whole. So as we know, our country and our world are incredibly diverse, and I feel like I need to write about that, right? We all need stories that reflect that diversity. But I also know, as a doctor and a writer, that people, no matter how different we may seem, are also very much fundamentally the same. We all crave safety and love and understanding. And books, writing them, reading them, and sharing them are the key to opening minds and creating the world that we all need, want, and deserve. A world in which everyone is understood, accepted, and celebrated, no matter where we come from, what we look like, who we love, what gender we are, or how we worship. In these times when book bans are on the rise, it is crucial as a literary community and as citizens of the world that we push back so that diverse books continue to be able to open mind and hearts. Sometimes it's the things we struggle with the most that not only make us stronger, but ultimately bring us the greatest joy. And often it's in the pages of books, safe places to experience different emotions and test out new ideas that we wind up doing much of our growing up. And as important as it is to see ourselves reflected in books, it's arguably more important to read books about people who are not like us, because it's not all about me, it's about us. So when I talk to young people about Red, White, and Whole, I tell them that none of us is just one thing, and that is what makes us beautiful. I stand before you as proof, a doctor and a writer, an Indian American, a mother, wife, and daughter, here with an open mind and heart, thanks in large part to the stories that I've read. Seeing ourselves reflected in books makes us believe that we can tell our own stories, in writing, of course, but also in classrooms and libraries, in music, art, theater, and sports, and in the everyday ways that we are all constantly telling stories about ourselves and about each other. So let's keep books open to young readers. Let's keep opening books, opening minds, and opening hearts. Let's continue to celebrate our differences and our commonalities. Let's continue through stories to explore all the facets of the wondrous creatures that we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajani, for your fabulous remarks. Now, let's move on to the presentation of the winner and the honorees of the 2022 Walter Awards in the teen category. First, the honorees. Melinda Lowe is the author of Last Night at the Telegraph Club, which actually began as a short story called New Year in the YA anthology All Out, the no longer secret stories of queer teens throughout the ages. Melinda does extensive research for all of her books, and research for the Last Night at the Telegraph Club included her going to the physical locations of the lesbian bars from that time period, even though they no longer exist, just to see what it would feel like to walk the blocks between them. Melinda has a background as a journalist covering queer, bisexual, and lesbian women in entertainment and media, and she was awarded the Sarah Pettit Memorial Award for Excellence in LGBT Journalism by the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association in 2006. Since Melinda isn't able to be here today, her editor, Andrew Carr, will accept her award on her behalf. Andrew, will you please join me at the podium to accept Melinda's award? All right, next, I am very excited to acknowledge honoree Kekla Magoon, the author of Revolution in Our Time. Kekla graduated with a history degree from Northwestern University and says she loves history because many amazing, talented, brave, and creative people have gone before us, and hearing their stories helps her understand how the world got to be the way it is today. She is also a repeat Walter Honoree, if you couldn't tell from that slideshow. In 2016, her book, X, a Novel, co-authored by Ilyasa Shabazz, also received a Walter Honor. As for some fun facts about Kekla, if she were to write a song about her high school years, she would title it Everything is Awesome and Other Forms of Denial. And if she could be a contestant on any game show, she would choose Jeopardy! Kekla, will you join me at the podium to accept your award? Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce our 2022 Walter Award winner in the teen category, Angeline Bully, the author of Firekeeper's Daughter. Angeline was first inspired to write this book when she was a high school senior, and a friend of hers at another school met a guy who turned out to be an undercover narcotics officer. She wanted to write a story about why an officer might need the help of an Ojibwe teen. While drafting this novel, Angeline was still working as the director of the Office of Indian Education at the U.S. Department of Education, and she often woke up at 5 a.m. to get in a few hours of writing before work. And Angeline has a unique connection to We Need Diverse Books. In 2019, she participated as a mentee in our annual mentorship program. Over the course of the year, she edited Firekeeper's Daughter with her mentor, Francisco X. Stork, who also wrote the 2018 Walter Honored book, Disappeared. We Need Diverse Books is thrilled at her success since then. Let's give a warm welcome to Angeline.
Bonjour, Anin, Angeline Bully, Miskwa Makwa Nidishnakas, Makwa Dodam, Bawating, and Donjaba. Hello, everyone. I'm Angeline Bully, Bear Clan, and I am from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. Miigwech to the fellow teen honorees, Kekla Magoon and Melinda Lowe. Miigwech to the 2022 Judging Committee, and to We Need Diverse Books. Miigwech also to Team Firekeeper, the wonderful people at Holt Books for Young Readers, in particular my former editor, Tiffany Liao, and everyone at Macmillan Children's Publishing Group. I'd also like to thank my agent, Faye Bender. Like Grace said, this is a full circle moment. In 2017, I had applied for the We Need Diverse Books mentorship program, and I did not get picked. I decided to work really hard on improving my craft over that year, and I decided to apply again. So it was a year later, October of 2018, that I applied again, and I could see the difference in my writing quality just over that 15-page sample that I submitted in 2018 versus what I had submitted in 2017. I was selected for it and paired with Francisco X. Stork, who is the most kind, generous, wonderful person. Working with him and getting his critique, his feedback on my book was truly a dream come true. When we finished our program, he said, "I really think you have something here, Angeline, and I've talked with my agent, and she would be thrilled if you considered submitting your manuscript to her." Well, I had also been querying agents in other avenues, but Francisco was right. Faye was the ideal agent for me, and I'm so thankful for her guidance. This story came about starting when I was 18. Also, when I was 18, it was the first time I had ever read a book that featured a Native American main character. It wasn't until I read that book that I realized, why hadn't I read that before? It also was not very good representation. So I did not feel as comforted at the end of the book as I did at the beginning. I truly believe that representation in literature for children and teens is so important. The younger a child is when they see themselves in the pages of the book, it changes how they view themselves and their place in the world. I know that had I been seen in the pages of a book, and that my Ojibwe identity, my connection to my culture, language, family, and land, that it could be my greatest strength, it would have been a revelation. In that spirit, Chimagwech, big thank you to Walter Dean Myers and all that he embodied. Thank you to all storytellers helping kids and teens to feel seen and validated and loved. We need all of your stories. Miigwech.
So I think all I have to do now is thank you for coming. So thank you for coming to the Walter Awards this year. It has been such an inspiring morning, and we hope that you take this inspiration home with you, however near or far that might be. You're more than welcome to adjourn to the adjacent event space where there will be book sales and book signings. Please purchase the books, and like I said, share them with as many kids as you know. And many thanks again to our 2022 winners and honorees, the judging committee, Politics and Prose, BookBub, and all of you for joining us today. Thank you.